There is so much, isn't there, in that story of Naaman the Aramean, or the Syrian as other translations translate it, for all those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. It's been used by so very many people down through the years to preach the gospel. It's been used evangelistically. And the first lesson I'd like to draw from this wonderful account today is the importance of a faithful witness. I'm thinking, of course, of a young girl from the land of Israel. It was lovely that Paula 3 weeks ago drew our attention to her there in the all-age service, because what an encouragement to our own young people, wasn't it, to hear her story. And without her, of course, none of what follows would have taken place. The 9th century BC was a very difficult time in the history of Israel. The days of Solomon and David were way, way behind. And you'll remember the kingdom had split in two after the death of Solomon. And the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, they were now under attack from the Syrians, the Arameans, north of them again. And in one of the many Aramean raids down into the territory of Israel, the Arameans had captured this young Israelite girl. Now, can you just imagine? We've got enough examples in our own day, haven't we, as we look across at places like Ukraine. Can you imagine what it must have been like, the trauma that young girl must have been put to as she was captured, as she was taken away from her family, from all that she had known. She had been taken by soldiers speaking a language she probably didn't understand, to a foreign country, a country whose beliefs, whose customs were completely at odds with her own. And there in that country, she had been forced to serve as a slave to the wife of the general of the army who had captured her. It may even have been the case, we don't know, we're not told, but it may even have been the case that her parents or members of her family had been killed, therefore, by the very man in whose household she now served. That is an awful lot, isn't it? For a young girl to have experienced and to have endured. And we could understand, couldn't we, if that experience had left her absolutely hating the people who were responsible, and especially hating the man in whose household she now served. One commentator that I read wrote this, and I think it's a wonderful quote. What a priceless treasure Naaman brought home from that war in the person of the little captive maid who not only knew God's power, but had a full measure of God's grace stored up in her little heart. What a wonderful little gospel preacher she was. Suppose she had harbored natural resentments against Naaman. Suppose she had cherished secret satisfaction in her heart that the man who had stolen her away as a captive should be a leper. Suppose she had said, "It serves him right." Then the world would have been robbed of this wonderful story of salvation. She is one of God's precious nobodies who have a great reward in heaven. Isn't that lovely? She is one of God's precious nobodies who have a great reward in heaven. I love that. See, in today's celebrity culture, where some people simply want to be famous for being famous. It's good to be reminded, isn't it, of what the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1, 26 to 29. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. Why? So that no one may boast before him. So here she is, this young servant girl, surrounded by so much discouragement to her faith. The pagans around her, they were the ones who seemed to have all of the power. They were the ones who had all of the influence. Her, she had none. At least so it seemed. Perhaps that's how we feel as disciples of Jesus in our culture today. And yet, what does she do? She opens her mouth and she speaks out to Naaman's wife about what she knows and believes. If only, she says to her mistress, if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. She knows, doesn't she? She knows the only hope for Naaman lies in what the God of Israel could do for him. And she is not afraid to speak out and to say so. Not only is she not afraid to speak out and say so, she cares enough. She cares enough to speak out and to say so. What a challenge for us today, isn't it? When it comes to the gospel, do we share, I wonder, the confidence of the Apostle Paul when he writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. I think sometimes we act, don't we, as though we are ashamed of the gospel, as though we're not really 100% convinced that the gospel is indeed the power of God for salvation, and therefore that every single man and woman out there in that big wide world needs it, that they will not be going anywhere good, anywhere they would want to be going after they leave this world, if they have rejected Jesus, the lifeline God has given us. I wonder, do we believe that? Because whether or not we really believe that will shape all of our actions, won't it? And our priorities. That young girl knew that what she knew could help Naaman. And so she spoke out. She wasn't ashamed. Not only was she not ashamed, she wasn't intimidated, young and very far from home, and totally vulnerable, as she was. She had no power, did she? She couldn't predict what the response would be, whether she would be positively received or punished in some way for daring to suggest such a thing. And so we see in this story the importance of faithful witness, which made everything that follows possible. And it's so important, isn't it, that we pray and we look for opportunities ourselves to be faithful witnesses and to tell what we know. Good news for everyone. We're hoping, we've done the Llanfair show for a couple of years now. We are hoping that we might be able to cover more of the local agricultural shows, to be there with the Word of God, willing to talk and share with people who come by on a happy day when they're relaxed, when they're out and about, having a good time, to be there with the gospel, sharing. And we'll be talking, Robert said we can have a word with you as a congregation in the next weeks ahead to encourage others, because we can't do all the shows, the number we are at the moment. We're just not enough to be able, between us, to cover every single show in the hinterland around Welshpool. But we hope, as we'll be mentioning later, that there will be those who might be willing to come and tell what they know, to be there ready to share with anyone who is, as they pass by, willing to stop and chat. But we also see, secondly, here in this story, and it could hardly be more relevant as we watch our news broadcasts at the moment, we also see, don't we, the perils of worldly power and expectations. And we see those perils, firstly, in the king of Israel, and then we see them in Naaman. Only with Naaman, of course, there is some excuse, because Naaman is a pagan. Whereas in the king of Israel, there is no excuse, because he's an Israelite. And what is so shocking to realize is that Joram, the king of Israel, seems to be less well informed about what's going on, doesn't he, than this little young servant girl who'd been taken captive up into Syria by Naaman. And so just look at his reaction when Naaman turns up on his doorstep with this letter that the king of Aram had sent to the king of Israel, asking the king of Israel, cure Naaman. And what's his reaction? He tore his clothes and said, am I God to give life or death, that this man sends words to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Just look and see how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me. His mind, in other words, is working purely at the level of politics and power. Whereas the servant girl's thoughts, they had turned to the fact that the prophet Elisha in Israel was known to be able to perform miracles. Joram's only thought is that the king of Aram is trying to pick a fight. The idea of sending for Elisha apparently didn't even occur to him. He is entirely worldly in his thinking and in his calculations, and how very dangerous that can be, as I think some of our world leaders at the moment are going to discover. And it's not surprising that he should be that way, because we realize who Joram's parents were, the king of Israel. His parents were none other than the notorious Ahab and Jezebel. He was the child of that marriage of a king of Israel to a pagan princess, the child of Ahab and Jezebel. So it's perhaps not very surprising that a servant girl would be more in tune with the ways of the God of Israel. And what an implicit rebuke there is for King Joram, isn't there, in that message which Elisha sends him. Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel. Joram might prefer to ignore the fact, ungodly king as he was. But Naaman the pagan would discover it to be true. There was a God in Israel. Just look, though, at the barriers which stand in Naaman's way as he arrives there at Elisha's door, because these are barriers which are still very common today, aren't they? And we recognize these barriers as we attempt today to share the gospel with people. Firstly, as he turns up at Elisha's door, there is the barrier of his preconceived ideas. Elisha tells him, "Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you shall be clean." And Naaman is absolutely hopping mad, isn't he? At the very thought. "I thought," he said, "that for me, he would surely come out, stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy." Surely, that's how he imagined the prophets back home would do it. But of course, the prophets back home hadn't, had they? The prophets back home hadn't done a thing for him. And how very nearly Naaman's preconceived ideas of how things ought to be done and how God should work, how very nearly those preconceived ideas turned him away from this healing that he so desperately wanted and needed. And it is exactly the same today with the gospel, isn't it? The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1:22-24, he said, "Jews demand miraculous signs. Greeks, the pagan world, Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." What could seem more unlikely, Paul is saying, than a crucified Messiah? And yet that is the way that God has chosen to provide for our salvation. And those who are willing to lay to one side their preconceived ideas of how God should act, they discover that in that apparent act of total weakness and folly in Jesus dying upon a cross, there actually turns out to be the power of God and the wisdom of God for our salvation. But it wasn't just Naaman's preconceived ideas which so nearly kept him from being restored. If only it had just been that. But it was also his pride and his prejudice. I wonder, did you hear it in his voice? "I thought that for me, Naaman, commander of the army of Aram, here with my chariots outside his door, that for me, he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God. Doesn't he realize what a very important man I am? Fancy just sending a message out to me. He ought to make a bit of an effort for someone like me." I don't know about you, I can see shades here surely of the sort of pride and arrogance of the powerful that were on show in the White House. a week last Friday in that shameful meeting. He is so full, this man, of his own importance in the most arrogant and unhealthy way. And it very nearly costs him dear, doesn't it? And that deadly mixture of human pride and prejudice continues, doesn't it, as he ridicules the Jordan River, in which Elisha had just told him to go and wash 7 times. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? What's the answer? The answer is no. The rivers of Damascus, writes Bishop Tom Wright, the rivers of Damascus were indeed greater than the muddy stream of Jordan, but they had never parted to let God's people through to the promised land. They could not serve as symbols of new life. If he truly wanted to be healed, there was only one river to which he could go, and that was the river of God's appointing. And the very same is true, isn't it, for our salvation? There is only one river in which we can wash and be saved. And that is that river which flows from the cross of Jesus. There is no other place if we want to know God's mercy and be saved. Pride and prejudice so very nearly turned Naaman away, but thank God for the common sense of the servants he had with him. Father, they say, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, wash and be clean? Such a very simple, straightforward thing, wasn't it? Not very demanding. Simple and straightforward. Just like the gospel message. Turn to Christ and be saved. What could be simpler than that? Wash in that cleansing tide. Come, wash in that cleansing tide that flows from the cross of Jesus and be clean. Put your pride and your prejudice aside and just do it. And so it is that Naaman finally comes to discover the unostentatious power of God. So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. And you know, it wasn't just his body that was healed that day, was it? His soul was saved there that day as well. And you can see that as you read on in the Bible to verses 15 to 19. Naaman discovered centuries beforehand that truth which I quoted back at the beginning of the Apostle Paul as he writes in 1 Corinthians 27 to 29, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. There won't be one single boaster in the glory of the world to come. There really won't. Every single person in the glory of the world to come who is there will know they have no grounds for boasting. Thereby They're there by the grace and mercy of God alone. And what a different man emerges from that river as a result of humbling himself to do God's bidding. He's a man who's not just new on the outside, whole again, healed, but he's a man who is new on the inside as well. He no longer talks, does he? The way he was talking when he arrived. He no longer talks like a master. Now he talks like a servant. As he says to Elisha in verse 17, your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. So a man transformed then by the unostentatious power of God. Power, of course, made perfect in all of the disgrace and all of the weakness of the cross. Made perfect in that way so that it could transform your life and mine as well. So what a lot this story of Naaman has to teach us then, doesn't it? I'll sum up as I close. It teaches us about the importance of a faithful witness from our lives, just as much as from the life of that young servant girl. It tells us about the perils of worldly power and expectations. Those perils which blinded King Joram to God and which so nearly kept Naaman from receiving the healing he needed. And it tells us supremely about the unostentatious power of God, which challenges all of our preconceptions of how God works in the world and in our lives.